I'll be reading Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 14. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You're the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden.
Good morning. Howdy. Well, that was quick, Nathan. He was quick on that one. Well, if you're back from the ARC trip, we're glad you made it back safe. If you're a guest this morning, we're thankful you're with us. We're going to be in Matthew 5, where Hoyt read from, and I want to introduce the lesson this way. We often talk about making sure we're understanding their world through their eyes. So when we're reading the text, we're trying to understand it first, at least, the way they understood it. One of the problems for today's passage is going to be something as simple as salt. It's everywhere, right? My grandma loves to steal the packets from McDonald's, get extra salt on her fries. They're on the tables. And we can't emphasize this enough. That is the importance of salt in the ancient world. She doesn't really steal it, by the way. They give it to her. Don't be misled by its abundance. Did you know at some points in history that salt and gold by ounce were a one-for-one trade? Whatever that weight was in gold was worth its weight in salt. At other times in the ancient world, salt was used as their currency. It's why to this day someone's pay is called their salary, which is basically shorthand for their pay for salt, their salt money. To this day, when someone earns their pay, we say they're worth their salt, and it comes from that old idea. There have been salt wars. You can type salt war into Google and you'll see like 10 different wars fought over salt, spanning several centuries in North America, Asia, and Europe. And helpful to us today, salt also has a deep biblical tradition. By its importance in the ancient world and how it was so important for different aspects of life, Paul writes this in Colossians 4, 5, and 6. Turn there with me. We're going to look at three salt texts, before we get to our text in Matthew. Colossians 4, 5, and 6. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. So start with that thought. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Salty speech was his shorthand for words that have been thought about. Words that have been made palatable. Words that were given through the lens of graciousness. How do you speak to others, especially those on the outside? Shocking here. With grace. You speak to them with grace. In the Old Testament especially, salt was important to the Hebrew covenant. And I think I've heard this before preparing for this lesson, but it really shocked me how prevalent it is in the Old Testament, especially in the way that it's used here. Look at Numbers 18 and verse 19. If you beat everybody there, you can start turning to 2 Chronicles 13 with your other hand. Numbers 18 and verse 19. All the offerings of the holy gifts which the sons of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and your daughters with you as a perpetual allotment. Emphasis on the word perpetual. It is an everlasting covenant. Emphasis on the word everlasting. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord to you and to your descendants with you. What does it mean that it's a covenant of salt? A covenant of salt. While you're thinking about that, read the other text in 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 5. Do you not know that the Lord God of Israel gave rule over Israel forever, emphasis on the word forever, to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? A covenant of salt. You'll notice in both places there's words like forever, everlasting, perpetual. And the idea is that God's covenant with Israel was forever. It was a covenant of salt. In that world, salt is used for preservation, to take things that might not last that long and make them last. And the idea that God's covenant was a covenant of salt means to say it would be a covenant that would be preserved. A covenant was good, but a covenant of salt is one of deep promise, one of preservation. We won't read this one, but another one is in Leviticus. If you go read Leviticus 2, every grain offering, every one they offered, was given with salt. And just to remind you, the salt was precious, not cheap table salt. It was an expensive offering to the Lord. Now, with all that in the back of our mind, let's turn to Matthew 5. Hopefully all that will make it mean more to you when Jesus says, you are the salt of the world. Matthew 5, I'm going to be starting in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of the commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so what I want to do is deal with verse 13 and deal with it very basically. Let's talk about the word you. Let's talk about the word salt. You. Matthew 5, 13 through 20, which we just read, should not be thought of anything new. Jesus isn't starting a new speech. This is a continuation, just like most of what we've talked about so far, of the Sermon on the Mount. And what's interesting in the beginning of the sermon and the Beatitudes, it's not always so clear that he's talking about them. He makes it seem like he's talking about a third party sometimes. Let me help you see that. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is. Blessed are the meek, for they. Okay, not me, not you, they. But then he does switch to the first person at times. He makes it clear that he wants the hearers to identify with his message. For instance, he says, blessed are you when others revile against you and persecute you. Here he continues addressing the audience directly. You are the salt of the earth. What it means to be salt was applicable to them. And I think it's applicable to us today. You, church, are the salt of the earth. Salt. Salt is for preservation, for healing, for flavor, and also when it comes to people, peace. And we'll talk about that one in a moment. Preservation. To preserve the corruptible. That's one thing salt did in their time. Like, they did not have refrigerators. They did not have ice chests. And so they preserved their food at times. They preserved their meat. Healing. As early as 400 years before Christ, the Greeks were using salt medically, like through saline or salt inhalation. And that's where they would go in a spa when they had some sort of nasal problem in order to leave it. Or salt on wounds for healing. As the salt of the earth, the church is the one that takes the place of Jesus in preaching the good news. Preaching the good news. Is the good news the news that saves? Yes or no? But do you know saves is a loaded word? We've talked about that before. The Greek, the word for saves and the word for heals is not different. It's the same. When a lady comes up to Jesus and asks to be healed, or he says, your faith has healed you. Some of your versions say your faith has healed you, and some of your versions say your faith has saved you. One's not wrong. They're the same word. What needs to happen for us is to have a greater understanding of salvation, not just a get out of hell free card. It's about being changed and saved now. Or to put in the context of the rest of Jesus' sermon, to live life in the kingdom now. Sozo, that's the verb. The news that heals, the news that saves. Salt heals. Flavor. This is the most common usage. And I think for people it means influence. That the places you touch should be more salty. To make a room or a setting taste like Jesus. To have more peace, more love, more Christ. And only you know if that's been true for the places you've been. Now, salt also in Jesus' teaching, when a person is salted, means to have peace. Mark 9 and verse 50. Salt is good, but if the salt becomes unsalty, with what will you make it salty again? All makes sense? Have salt in yourselves. Okay, Jesus, you lost me. What do you mean, have salt in yourselves? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Preservation, healing, flavor, and peace. This is what salt meant in the ancient world. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet, is what Jesus says here in Matthew 5. What does that mean? If we aren't preserving the world around us, if we aren't healing the world around us, if we aren't flavoring the world around us, if we aren't bringing peace to the world around us, then you're not living life in the kingdom. And you're not the salt of the earth. Or to say it this way, if Christ is a name we wear, but not someone's footsteps that we follow after, our salt has lost its flavor. Another important thing is that we commonly feel like we, and I'm using we kind of accommodatively, mainly others, are made, notice the distinction, sinful. That living for God is our second-hand purpose. I'm going to call that recycling. God takes garbage and He gives it a second-hand life. I think that's bad. This is one of the problems when, for instance, Calvinistic lenses have leaked into our worldview. It teaches that humans are inherently wicked, babies are born sinful, and on our best days, we are naturally animalistic. And unless God performs a miracle, we will have no chance to do better. And it ignores some things that Scripture teaches us. For one, that God finds innate value in humanity. The way this is expressed to us is, there's a Latin phrase for it, the imago Dei, or in English, the image of God. God said, I have made man in my image and after my likeness. He made man, and he said it was very good. And he tries to tell us that we're made in his image. And the reason I'm going on this tangent is because it means your fullest life is in the kingdom, not your secondary life. You're not recycled for kingdom life. When you live in the kingdom, you're living the way that God made you for. That's how he made you. It's good news because we don't believe in recycling, but restoration. Restoration. You are not recycled for secondhand use. You are restored for what you were always intended to be. That makes living in the kingdom much easier to grasp for us. Jesus sees those in the kingdom as having purpose. But then he doesn't see those outside of the kingdom as valueless. He sees those in the kingdom as having purpose, and those outside of the kingdom themselves as valuable and loved enough to be restored. He wants more for them. Or to make it, I hope, convicting for us, you have never met or can think of a single person that wasn't made for the kingdom. Nobody. There's nobody that wasn't made for the kingdom. And I hope this might change your view of others. Next, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but then you are the light of the world. What does it mean to be light? What does light do? Light brings lost things home. Lost people have been saved by following the light. Ships have been saved by lighthouses, guiding them safe to shore. Or in Scripture, for example, in the wilderness, God was present in the camp at night as what? Do you remember? A pillar of fire. And the text doesn't just say he was a pillar of fire. He was a pillar of fire so that they could travel at night. They traveled at night too in the tabernacle, in the tent. He was there to light the way, to show the way, to guide the way. God was present in the camp as a pillar of fire that they may travel by night. The light guides. The light, especially in the ancient world when in darkness, orients us. For instance, in Jesus' teaching, he uses the idea of a lamp. There's no light switches. That's how you see in the dark, a lamp. Or maybe you might think of a star. The world can be a dark, dark place, and you might be someone's North Star. You know what's interesting is like the light, the North Star, is better to trust than a compass. Because a compass can get messed up with like the magnetic field and stuff. You can never not walk north if you're in the northern hemisphere, if you follow the northern star. I don't want you to fact check me. When Jesus was here, he was the light, right? Doesn't he say that in John's gospel? I am the light of the world. But here he says, you are the light. When Jesus here, he was the light. But he has not left humanity in the dark. He's left his church. He said, I am the light of the world. But then he says to you, you are the light of the world. Verses 17 through 20. I've been preaching for a long time. Not like long in years, but I've been going like 40 minutes. So I threw y'all a bone today. It's a short one. 17 through 20. We're almost halfway done. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. I really want to focus on verse 20. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the fulfillment of the law stuff later in the Sermon on the Mount. But what he says in verse 20 is interesting. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then ask, what does that mean? What does it mean for your righteousness to surpass the scribes and the Pharisees? And you might have a lot of answers for that, but I think to say it simply, Jesus is calling for our insides to match our outsides. Like later on, what Jesus is going to say is, the Pharisees are like sepulchres. They're like pearly white on the outside, but inside are dead men's bones. There's no life inside. Jesus isn't just concerned for the kingdom to look righteous, but to be righteous. To not look loving, but to be loving. Not to look like a place of grace. And you could go down the list, but to be that. When we first meet the light, here's one of the other things that light does. It shows us what's wrong in our little world. What's wrong in our hearts. There's lots of that in the New Testament about light. Every deed will be exposed when it comes into the contact of the light. There's a lot in John's Gospel about light. But when we first meet the light, we have to recognize everything in our lives and heart that shouldn't be there. And then the question is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to leave it there, or are you going to thank Jesus for showing you? Live in the light. Be the salt. Be the light. Okay? That's a sermon. Today, if you want to be a part of Jesus' kingdom, if you want to be immersed into Christ, if you need the prayers of the church, would you come as we stand and as we sing?